Danielle Price walked through the revolving doors of Silvercrest Bank, feeling the cool autumn breeze at her back. It was early morning, the city still waking up, but Danielle's mind had been buzzing for hours. Her reflection caught in the glass a tall, poised black woman in her early 40s, wearing a tailored navy suit that fit her perfectly. The quiet confidence she projected was the result of years of hard work and perseverance, both on the battlefield and in the boardroom. Silvercrest was one of the city's most prestigious financial institutions. Its towering glass facade and polished marble floors radiated wealth and power, the kind Danielle had spent the last decade fighting to claim her piece of. Today was the culmination of years of effort. Her company, Vanguard Analytics, had developed a groundbreaking financial security software, and she was here to finalize a deal with Silvercrest's top brass. If all went well, Vanguard would cement its place in the financial world, a leader in cutting-edge security technology. As she stepped into the massive lobby, Danielle noticed the way people glanced at her, some quick, appraising looks, others lingering a bit too long. She was used to it by now. Being a black woman in a world dominated by white men meant always being seen, but rarely being understood. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced down to see a message from her assistant, Lena Hill. "Everything is set for the meeting. They seem eager, but keep your guard up." Lena had been with her since the early days, another veteran who had served with her overseas. They were more than just colleagues. They were sisters, in arms, bound by the shared experience of fighting for survival in a world that didn't always welcome them back with open arms. Danielle slipped her phone into her bag and walked toward the elevator, her heels clicking sharply against the polished marble. Today, her calm exterior masked the storm brewing inside. The deal with Silvercrest wasn't just about money. It was about validation. After years of being overlooked, doubted, and undermined, today she would prove to the world and to herself that she belonged in the upper echelons of the business world. The elevator doors slid open, and Danielle stepped into the private conference area where the senior executives of Silvercrest Bank were waiting. She was greeted by Ethan Blackwood, the CEO. He was tall, with perfectly coiffed silver hair and an air of practiced charm. Everything about him screamed old money and privilege. "Ms. Price," Ethan said smoothly, extending a hand. "We've heard impressive things about Vanguard Analytics. We're eager to see what you've got." Danielle smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. She had met countless men like Ethan before, men who underestimated her at first glance. But underestimating Danielle Price was always a mistake. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, shaking his hand firmly. "I'm looking forward to showing you how Vanguard can revolutionize your security systems." She took a seat at the long mahogany conference table, flanked by several other executives, all men, all white. Lena sat across the room, ready to support Danielle, her steady gaze providing reassurance. Lena, like Danielle, had fought her own battles, both in uniform and in corporate America. Together, they were a formidable team. As the meeting began, Danielle delivered her pitch with precision. She outlined how her software would protect Silvercrest's wealthiest clients from financial fraud, using real-time data analytics to detect suspicious activity before it could cause harm. Her presentation was flawless, the product of countless late nights and tireless preparation. But as she spoke, she couldn't help but notice the subtle glances exchanged between the executives. There was a tension in the room, something unspoken but palpable. Ethan Blackwood maintained his polished smile, but there was a coldness behind his eyes, a sense of calculation that put Danielle on edge. As the presentation wrapped up, one of the senior executives, Tom Jensen, spoke up. He was a middle-aged man with graying hair and a condescending tone that immediately raised Danielle's hackles. "This is all very impressive, Ms. Price," Jensen said, leaning back in his chair. "But given the complexity of your software, do you think your team has the expertise to handle something of this scale?" Danielle stiffened. She knew exactly what he was implying. He didn't outright say it, but she had heard it before. How could a black woman possibly run a company that could handle something so sophisticated? Lena's eyes flicked to Danielle, silently urging her to stay calm. Danielle took a breath, her military training kicking in, and responded evenly. "My team is comprised of some of the most talented engineers and cybersecurity experts in the field. We've successfully implemented this software for multiple financial institutions. I assure you, we're more than capable of handling Silvercrest's needs." Jensen didn't seem satisfied, but he nodded curtly, his expression unreadable. The conversation shifted back to Ethan, who assured Danielle they would review the proposal thoroughly before making any final decisions. As the meeting ended and Danielle stood to leave, Jensen's parting words lingered in the air. "Well, be in touch. But these things take time, you understand?" It was the same old story: delays, doubts, and second-guessing. Danielle had seen it all before, but that didn't make it any less infuriating. She nodded politely and left the room, her heart pounding with frustration. Emotional low. Outside the conference room, Danielle and Lena exchanged a look. Danielle could feel the weight of the unspoken words between them. The frustration, the anger, the exhaustion of always having to prove herself again and again. Even with all her success, all her accomplishments, there was still a glass ceiling above her, one made not of talent or skill, but of prejudice and fear. "They'll come around," Lena said quietly, but even she sounded unconvinced. Danielle exhaled slowly. Yeah, maybe. But deep down, Danielle knew that it wouldn't be that simple. She had fought for everything she had, and today, just like every day, she would have to keep fighting. Danielle stood in the lobby of Silvercrest Bank, replaying the meeting in her mind. Though the pitch had gone well, the undercurrents of doubt and racial bias were impossible to ignore. This deal was more than just a business transaction. It was her shot at proving that her company, Vanguard Analytics, could stand toe-to-toe with the biggest players in the financial world. But already she could feel the resistance. She walked over to the sleek coffee bar in the lobby, trying to shake off the meeting's aftermath. As she waited for her drink, her phone buzzed. A message from Lena. "Everything okay? You look tense in there." Danielle smiled faintly at the message. Lena always had her back, even when things were tough. "I'm fine. Just the usual resistance," she replied. Her coffee arrived, and as she took a sip, she noticed something unsettling across the lobby. Officer Tom Jensen, the same man who had been in the meeting, was staring at her. But this time, he wasn't dressed in his usual suit. He was in uniform. A police officer. The badge on his chest gleamed under the lobby lights, and the subtle smugness in his eyes made Danielle's skin prickle. He crossed the room with deliberate steps, his hands resting on his belt, his eyes never leaving hers. Something was off. This wasn't just a routine encounter, and Danielle could feel it. "Miss Price," Jensen said, his voice calm but cold, "I need to ask you a few questions." Danielle's pulse quickened. "Is something wrong, officer?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "There's been some suspicious activity involving your company," Jensen said, his tone casual, but laced with something darker. "I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to come with me." Emotional climax. The coffee cup nearly slipped from her fingers. This wasn't happening. Not here, not now. She was supposed to be closing a deal that would elevate her company to new heights, and now, out of nowhere, she was being treated like a criminal. Danielle set the cup down on the counter, her heart racing. She could feel the eyes of the lobby on her, people slowing down to watch the interaction. Her military training kicked in, forcing her to remain calm under pressure. "What's this about?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. Jensen's eyes narrowed slightly, as if enjoying the power he held in that moment. "Financial irregularities. I have a warrant to search your company's records. We've received reports that Vanguard Analytics might be involved in illegal activities." The words hit Danielle like a punch to the gut. Illegal activities. This was insane. Her company had built its reputation on integrity and transparency. And now she was being accused of fraud. "I assure you, there's been a mistake," Danielle said, but even as she spoke, she knew how this looked. A black woman standing in a high-powered financial institution, suddenly under suspicion of fraud. It didn't matter that she was innocent. In the eyes of many, the mere accusation would be enough to stain her name. Jensen stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Let's not make a scene. If you come quietly, we can clear this up. But if you resist..." He let the threat hang in the air. Danielle could feel the tension thickening around her. People in the lobby had stopped pretending not to stare. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to show weakness. She had faced worse on the battlefield. This was just a different kind of enemy. She wasn't going to be bullied, not by a corrupt cop, not by anyone. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Lena. "We've got a problem. Security breach at the office. Someone's trying to access our client data. It's bad." Danielle's stomach dropped. This was no coincidence. Whoever was coming after her wasn't just attacking her reputation. They were coming for her company, her livelihood. Her mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. Was this connected to the deal with Silvercrest? Was Jensen working for someone else? The timing was too perfect to ignore. She looked Jensen in the eye, her voice hard. "I'm not going anywhere without my lawyer." A flicker of annoyance crossed his face, but he nodded slowly. "Fine. We'll do this your way. But make no mistake, this isn't going away." As Jensen turned and walked away, Danielle's legs felt like they were going to give out. She quickly texted Lena back. "Shut everything down. Lock the systems. I'm coming back." Her hands were shaking, but she didn't have time to process the fear creeping up her spine. Everything was happening too fast. She needed to get back to the office, figure out what was going on, and get ahead of this before it destroyed everything she had worked for. Back at Vanguard's office, the tension was palpable. Lena was already deep in the server room, coordinating with the IT team to trace the breach. Danielle's head spun as she entered her office, trying to process the layers of betrayal and confusion swirling around her. "Tell me what's happening," Danielle demanded as Lena entered, her expression grim. We got hit hard, Lena said, handing her a tablet. Someone's trying to access our client data. We've locked down most of it, but they were inside long enough to do some damage. Danielle scrolled through the reports, feeling her frustration mount. Who's doing this? Lena shook her head. We don't know yet, but whoever it is, they're good. It's not some amateur hack. This is targeted. Danielle collapsed into her chair, running a hand through her hair. The stress of the day was crashing down on her like a wave. The deal with Silvercrest was already in jeopardy, and now this someone was systematically dismantling everything she had built. We need to fight back, Danielle said quietly, her voice filled with determination. Lena nodded. I've already reached out to our cybersecurity contacts. We'll figure out who's behind this. As the two women strategized, there was a knock on the door. Ethan Blackwood walked in, his face unreadable. Ms. Price, he said smoothly, I heard about the situation with Officer Jensen. I wanted to assure you that Silvercrest had nothing to do with this. Danielle narrowed her eyes. She didn't trust Blackwood, not for a second. His sudden appearance, his calm demeanor, all felt wrong. Is that so? She asked, crossing her arms. Blackwood's smile didn't waver. Of course. We're committed to ensuring that your company is treated fairly in this process. I hope this misunderstanding won't affect our business relationship. Danielle's eyes flicked to Lena, then back to Blackwood. There was something predatory in his gaze, something that made her stomach turn. She had seen that look before, in men who thought they could manipulate her, who thought they could use her for their own gain. Blackwood was playing a game, and she was at the center of it. I appreciate your concern, Mr. Blackwood, she said evenly, but I'll handle this on my own. Blackwood's smile faltered for a moment, but he recovered quickly. I'm sure you will. But if you need any assistance, you know where to find me. He turned to leave, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. As the door closed behind him, Danielle let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Lena frowned. That was weird. Weird doesn't cover it, Danielle muttered. He's up to something. I can feel it. Emotional low. Danielle stared out the window, her mind racing. She felt trapped, surrounded by enemies she couldn't fully see. The racism she had faced earlier in the meeting now felt like a small piece of a much larger, more sinister puzzle. Whoever was coming for her wasn't just attacking her business, they were attacking her as a person, as a black woman trying to make it in a world that wasn't built for her. But she wasn't going to let them win. Not without a fight. Danielle sat in her office, staring blankly at the blinking cursor on her screen. It had been a few days since her confrontation with Officer Jensen, and everything felt like it was unraveling. The financial deal with Silvercrest Bank had been put on hold indefinitely, and her company's name was being dragged through the mud. Rumors were swirling, accusations of fraud whispered behind her back, and now the media had caught wind of the story. She glanced at the news headline that had been sent to her earlier that morning. Tech CEO Danielle Price. Under investigation is Vanguard Analytics involved in fraud. Emotional climax. The headline made her stomach turn. All the years she had spent building her company, her reputation, it could all be undone by a few false accusations. And the worst part was, she knew this was just about her company. It was about her. She had always felt the weight of being the only black woman in the room. But now that weight had become a noose, tightening around her neck. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Lena. Clients are pulling out. 3 so far today. We're in trouble. Danielle felt a chill run down her spine. This was exactly what whoever was behind this wanted. They were trying to discredit her, to make her seem untrustworthy, dangerous. If she lost her clients, it wouldn't just be her business that fell apart, would be her livelihood, her legacy. She stood up abruptly, pacing the room as the frustration built inside her. She had fought so hard to get to where she was, to build something meaningful after her time in the military. But now it felt like she was losing everything. The anger bubbled up inside her, threatening to spill over. There was a knock at the door. Lena stepped in, her face etched with worry. We need to talk, she said, her voice low. Danielle nodded, sitting down heavily at her desk. How bad is it? Lena sighed, pulling up a chair. It's not good. We're hemorrhaging clients. Jensen's accusations are all over the place, and people are starting to believe it. They're scared, Danielle. They think we're going down, and they don't want to go down with us. Danielle clenched her fists. This is all lies. We've done nothing wrong. I know that, Lena said softly. But perception is everything. We need to do something fast, or we're not going to survive this. Danielle leaned back, rubbing her temples. She could feel the weight of it all pressing down on her, the deal with Silvercrest slipping away, her company's reputation crumbling, and the ever-present racism that seemed to shadow her every move. The stress was suffocating, and in the quiet of her office, Danielle's mind drifted back to her time in the military. She closed her eyes, letting the memories wash over her. It had been years since she had worn her uniform, but the scars of war stayed with her. She remembered the days in Iraq, the endless heat, the sand that got into everything. But more than that, She remembered the feeling of always having to prove herself, not just to her team, but to the military establishment as a whole. She had been one of the first black women to lead a combat unit, a distinction that had earned her respect from her soldiers, but skepticism from her superiors. There had been whispers, doubts about whether she was fit for leadership, not because of her skills, but because of her race and gender. She had fought every day to show that she belonged, to prove that she was just as capable, more capable than anyone else. One mission in particular stood out. Her unit had been assigned to escort a convoy of supplies through a hostile area. The intel had been bad, and they were ambushed. Danielle had taken charge immediately, coordinating her soldiers, leading them through the chaos and getting everyone out alive. Her leadership had saved lives, and yet, when they returned to base, she had received little recognition. Instead, her superior officer had questioned her decisions, as if her success had been a fluke. The frustration of that moment had stayed with her, a reminder that no matter how hard she worked, no matter how many lives she saved, she would always be doubted. And now, years later, it felt like she was fighting the same battle, only this time it was bullets and bombs. It was lies and sabotage. Emotional low, Danielle opened her eyes, the memories of the battlefield mixing with the chaos of her current situation. It was a different kind of war, but the stakes felt just as high. She had survived the military, but could she survive this? Lena was watching her closely. "You okay?" she asked quietly. Danielle nodded, though she didn't feel okay. She felt like she was drowning, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't find the surface. "We're not going to let them win," Lena said firmly. "We've been through worse than this, remember?" Danielle smiled weakly. "Yeah, we've been through worse." But even as she said the words, doubt gnawed at her. Could they really come back from this? Could she fight against a system that had been rigged against her from the start? The next few days were a blur. Danielle and Lena worked around the clock, trying to stop the bleeding, trying to convince their clients that Vanguard wasn't the sinking ship the media was making it out to be. But it felt like every time they made progress, something else would knock them back. And then, in the middle of yet another late-night strategy session, Lena's phone rang. She frowned, answering quickly. "What are you sure?" Her eyes widened. "Send it to me. Now." She hung up, her face pale. "You're not going to believe this," she said, pulling up a file on her tablet. "We found something." Danielle leaned in, her heart racing. "What is it?" Lena handed her the tablet. "It's a connection between Jensen and Ethan Blackwood. They've been working together." Danielle stared at the screen, her mind reeling. Blackwood. She had known something was off about him, but it was worse than she had imagined. Jensen's investigation, the false accusations, it had all been orchestrated. Blackwood had used Jensen to try and take her down, to sabotage her company and destroy her reputation. Her hands shook with anger as she scrolled through the documents. There were emails, bank transfers, all linking Blackwood to Jensen's smear campaign. They had set her up, planned every move, and now she had the proof. "We need to take this public," Lena said, her voice fierce. "We can expose them." Danielle's mind raced. She wanted to, how she wanted to, but she knew this wasn't a decision to be made lightly. If they went public with this, the fallout would be massive. Blackwood was powerful, and Silvercrest Bank was one of the most influential institutions in the city. They wouldn't go down without a fight. But what choice did she have? If she didn't fight back now, they would destroy her. They would take everything she had worked for, and she would be left with nothing. "He'll call our lawyer," Danielle said, her voice steady. "We're going to war." Lena nodded, her expression grim. "Let's bring them down." Danielle stared at the email, her mind racing. The evidence Lena had found, clear proof that Ethan Blackwood and Officer Jensen had been working together to sabotage her, was her weapon. After everything they had done, she finally had something to fight back with. "They're not getting away with this," she said, her voice hard with determination. "We're going public." Lena nodded, her face set in resolve. "He'll send everything to the lawyer. We'll file the lawsuit first thing tomorrow." Danielle's stomach twisted with anxiety, but she knew this was the only way forward. She was about to declare war on some of the most powerful people in the city, people who wouldn't hesitate to use every resource they had to destroy her. Next morning, Vanguard's legal team filed a lawsuit against both Blackwood and Officer Jensen. The accusations were explosive conspiracy, defamation, fraud. Danielle's name was now tied to one of the biggest scandals the city had seen in years. As the news broke, Danielle felt a surge of vindication. The same outlets that had questioned her integrity were now running headlines like, "Tech CEO Strikes Back, Danielle Price Sues, Bank CEO for Fraud and Conspiracy." Rising tension. But the backlash was swift. Ethan Blackwood responded with his own media blitz, claiming that Danielle was fabricating the accusations to cover up her company's financial issues. His connections in the corporate world ran deep, and within hours, public opinion had split in two. Some people believed Danielle, seeing her as a victim of a corrupt system. But others sided with Blackwood, accusing her of playing the race card to gain sympathy. Danielle sat in her office, staring at the barrage of messages flooding her inbox. Some were from supporters, but many were from people who doubted her, who questioned her integrity. She had faced racism her entire life, but this was different. This was an all-out assault on her character. "I'm not going to let them win," she said quietly to herself. The stakes were higher than ever, and there was no turning back now. As the lawsuit gained traction, Danielle's life became a whirlwind of stress and tension. Every day brought a new challenge, a media inquiry, a legal meeting, or another client backing out of a contract. Her team was shrinking, her resources dwindling, and it felt like she was losing the war, one battle at a time. But the worst blow came when Officer Jensen leaked false information about her military service. A smear campaign erupted, accusing Danielle of having committed war crimes while serving overseas. The claims were completely fabricated, but that didn't stop the media from running with the story. Emotional peak. Danielle sat in her office late one night, reading through the news articles with growing disbelief. Every headline felt like a knife to her chest. War crimes allegations. Surfaces Danielle Price, a hero or a villain. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes. This wasn't just an attack on her business, it was an attack on her very identity. Everything she had done, everything she had sacrificed, was being torn apart by people who had never known her, never fought beside her, and never cared about the truth. Lena came into the office, her face grim. "I saw the articles." Danielle wiped at her eyes quickly, trying to maintain her composure. "They're doing everything they can to destroy me." Lena sat down across from her, her expression softening. "They're scared. That's why they're hitting you so hard." "But what if they win?" Danielle's voice cracked with emotion. "What if they ruin me? I've worked my whole life for this, and now it feels like it's slipping away." Lena reached across the desk, taking her hand. "You've been through worse than this. You've survived worse. You didn't give up then, and you're not going to give up now." Danielle closed her eyes, letting the weight of Lena's words sink in. She had faced impossible odds before. In the military, she had been outnumbered, outgunned, and underestimated, just like she was now. But she had always found a way to survive. She had always fought back. She wasn't going to let them break her. Not now. "We fight," Danielle said finally, her voice steady. "We keep fighting." The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the rows, cameras flashing as Danielle walked in, her head held high. She could feel the weight of every gaze on her, judging her, doubting her. But she forced herself to block it out. Today was the day everything would come to a head. Today was the day she would face Ethan Blackwood and Officer Jensen in court. Lena was by her side, offering silent support, while her lawyer, Samantha O'Connor, prepared for the opening arguments. Samantha was one of the best in the business, sharp, fearless, and unrelenting. Danielle knew she was in good hands. Blackwood sat across the room, his face calm and unreadable. Jensen, dressed in his police uniform, maintained a smug expression, as if he believed there was no way they could lose. But Danielle had something they didn't evidence. The emails, the bank transfers, the documents Lena had uncovered. They all painted a damning picture of Blackwood's and Jensen's conspiracy. As the trial began, Samantha laid out the case with precision. She presented the evidence methodically, piece by piece, until it became impossible to deny that Blackwood and Jensen had conspired to destroy Danielle's business and reputation. Emotional peak. But even as the evidence mounted, there was still one final hurdle. A key witness and insider from Silvercrest Bank had been hesitant to testify, fearing retaliation. Danielle knew that without this testimony, their case might not be strong enough to bring Blackwood down. During a recess, Danielle approached the witness, Peter Collins, in the hallway. He looked nervous, glancing around as if expecting Blackwood's goons to come after him. "Peter," Danielle said softly, "I know this is hard, but we need you. I need you. You're the only one who can confirm what we've uncovered." Peter swallowed hard, avoiding her gaze. "If I testify, I'll lose everything. My career, my family's security. Blackwood will destroy me." Danielle's heart ached with empathy. She knew the fear he was feeling, the fear of standing up to people who held all the power. But she also knew that if he stayed silent, the corruption would continue. "If you don't speak up, Blackwood will keep doing this to people like me. People who don't have the resources or the platform to fight back," she said gently. "But if you testify, you can help bring him down. You can stop this." Peter hesitated, his face twisted with indecision. For a long moment, Danielle thought he was going to walk away. But then he nodded. "Okay, he'll do it." Peter's testimony was the turning point. He took the stand and confirmed everything: how Blackwood had used his power at Silvercrest to sabotage Vanguard, how Jensen had been paid off to launch the investigation against Danielle, and how the entire scheme had been orchestrated to ruin her. The courtroom was silent as Peter spoke, the truth unraveling like a thread that had been pulled too tightly. Even Blackwood's smug demeanor began to crack, his face growing tense as the weight of the evidence pressed down on him. By the end of the trial, the verdict was clear. Danielle had won. The court ruled in her favor, ordering Blackwood and Jensen to pay damages for defamation and conspiracy. Silvercrest Bank faced massive fines and regulatory scrutiny, and Blackwood himself was removed from his position as CEO. Danielle stood outside the courthouse, the sun shining down on her as reporters swarmed, shouting questions. But she didn't care about the media frenzy. All she cared about was the sense of relief flooding through her. She had won. She had fought back, and she had won. Lena appeared at her side, a broad smile on her face. "You did it." Danielle smiled back, a weight lifting off her shoulders. "We did it." But even as they stood there, celebrating their victory, Danielle knew this wasn't the end. Blackwood and Jensen might have been taken down, but the system that had allowed them to thrive was still very much in place. There were still battles to be fought. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of peace. The air in Danielle's office felt lighter than it had in months. The papers from the court case were finally settled, the evidence of her victory sitting neatly on her desk. But even with the satisfaction of winning the lawsuit, there was a quiet exhaustion that lingered in the back of her mind. She had spent months in survival mode, fighting for her reputation, her company, and her future. And now, with the battle over, the weight of everything she had been through came crashing down. Vanguard Analytics had taken a hit. There was no denying that. Some clients had left during the chaos, fearful of getting caught up in the public scandal. But Danielle knew that those who had stayed, the loyal few who had believed in her from the beginning, were the ones who truly mattered. They were the ones who saw her not just as a businesswoman, but as someone who had fought back against injustice and won. The office door opened quietly and Lena stepped in. She hadn't stopped smiling since the court's verdict had come in. "You ready?" she asked, her eyes twinkling with excitement. Danielle looked up from her desk and nodded. Today was a special day, not because of any big deal or major announcement, but because it was the day she was beginning to rebuild. The victory in court had been a turning point, but it wasn't the end. Now, she had to take the pieces of her business that had survived the onslaught and turn them into something stronger. They stepped into the boardroom, where the small team that remained at Vanguard was waiting. Faces that had been hardened by stress over the last few months now looked hopeful, determined. Danielle stood at the head of the table, feeling a surge of pride for these people who had stuck with her through the worst of it. "I know it's been a rough few months," Danielle began, her voice steady, "but we're still here. And that's because we didn't back down, even when things got tough. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know that we've proven we can survive anything. We fought together, and we won together." The team smiled back at her, nodding in agreement. There was a quiet strength in the room, a sense of solidarity that hadn't existed before the lawsuit. They had come through the fire, and now they were ready to rebuild. "We've got a lot of work ahead of us," Danielle continued, "but I know we can do it. Vanguard isn't just a company, it's a family. And families stick together, no matter what." Lena gave her a small smile from the corner of the room, her eyes filled with pride. Danielle had been through hell and back, but she had come out the other side stronger, more determined than ever. Later that evening, Danielle found herself alone in her office, staring out at the city skyline. The quiet hum of the financial district had settled over the streets below, the buildings glowing in the fading light. It was a peaceful view, but her thoughts were far from settled. Winning the lawsuit had been a victory, but it had come at a cost. Her company's reputation had been damaged, and though she had cleared her name, the emotional toll of the fight still weighed heavily on her. She had learned long ago, both in the military and in business, that victory didn't always feel like triumph. Sometimes it just felt like survival. She thought back to the courtroom, to the moment when Peter Collins had taken the stand and confirmed everything she had suspected about Blackwood's conspiracy. It had been a powerful moment, watching the truth come out, seeing the smug expressions on Blackwood and Jensen's faces crumble. But even in that moment of vindication, Danielle had known that this was just about one victory. The system that had allowed people like Blackwood to rise to power was still very much in place. The racism, the corruption, the manipulation, it wasn't going to disappear because she had won a court case. There would always be another battle to fight, another challenge to face. But now she knew she could handle it. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from an unknown number. "We know you're still out there. We're watching. Walk away while you still can." Danielle's heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to remain calm. This wasn't the first time she had received a threat since the lawsuit, and it probably wouldn't be the last. She had made powerful enemies by standing up to Blackwood, and she knew they weren't going to let her win without trying to drag her back down. But she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. She put the phone down, leaning back in her chair and closing her eyes for a moment. The threat only confirmed what she had already known: her fight was far from over. But that was okay. She was ready for whatever came next. A week later, Danielle stood at the entrance of a new building, one that didn't have the Vanguard Analytics logo on the door. This was something different. something that had been on her mind for a long time. The sign above the door read, "The Vanguard Foundation Empowering Black Veterans in Business." Danielle smiled as she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The space was still mostly empty, just a few desks and chairs, a couple of laptops set up on the tables, but to her, it felt like the beginning of something powerful. The foundation was her way of giving back, of helping others like her black veterans who had served their country only to come home and face the same systemic racism that had always been there. She had been lucky to find her way through the corporate maze, but she knew that many others hadn't been so fortunate. The Vanguard Foundation would be a resource for those veterans, providing mentorship, legal advice, and financial support to help them navigate the challenges of civilian life. It was something she wished had existed when she had first come home. And now, she had the power to create it for others. Lena walked in behind her, glancing around the space. "It's not much yet, but it's a start," she said with a grin. Danielle nodded, a sense of peace settling over her. "It's more than a start. It's a new beginning." As they stood there looking around the room, Danielle felt the weight of her decision settle over her like a warm cloak. She had fought for so long to build something that mattered, and now she had the chance to do something even bigger. The battles she had fought had given her strength, and now she was going to use that strength to help others. Lena turned to her, her voice soft. "You've come a long way." Danielle smiled, feeling a deep sense of pride and fulfillment. "We've come a long way, and we're not done yet." A few weeks later, Danielle stood at a veterans memorial, the names of fallen soldiers etched into the stone before her. The quiet of the moment was a stark contrast to the chaos of the past few months. But in that stillness, Danielle found a sense of clarity. The battles she had fought, both on the battlefield and in the corporate world, had shaped her into who she was today. She had been tested, pushed to her limits, and yet she had survived. She had thrived. And now she was determined to use her success to fight for others who were still in the trenches. She placed a small wreath at the base of the memorial, honoring the men and women who had served alongside her, some of whom had given their lives. It was a reminder of where she had come from, of the sacrifices she had made to get to where she was now. But it was also a reminder of the fight that was still ahead. The system wasn't going to change overnight, and there would always be people like Blackwood who would try to use their power for their own gain. But Danielle had made a choice. She wasn't going to walk away from the fight. She wasn't going to back down. As she stood there, her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Lena. "We've got the first group of veterans coming in next week. You ready?" Danielle smiled, slipping her phone back into her pocket. "Always." She turned away from the memorial and walked toward her future, her heart filled with determination and hope. The fight wasn't over, but now she was ready for whatever came next. "We need to address this head-on," Janet Harper said. "If we let this narrative control the conversation, it's going to spiral out of control." Victor stood up, pacing the room. "We're not going to let fear dictate our decisions. We're going to reach out to Albright and see if we can salvage the relationship. But we're not going to compromise on our values." The team looked at him, a mixture of concern and respect in their eyes. They knew that Victor was walking a fine line between standing firm and keeping the company afloat. But they also knew that his commitment to doing the right thing was unwavering. Victor arranged a meeting with Charles Albright, the CEO of Albright Enterprises. He knew that this would be his last chance to convince the company to stay on board. But he also knew that he couldn't sacrifice the airline's progress in exchange for financial security. The meeting took place in a sleek, modern conference room at Albright Enterprises headquarters. Charles, a tall man with silver hair and a steely gaze, sat across from Victor, his expression unreadable. "Victor," Charles began, his tone formal, "I'll be honest with you. I'm concerned about the direction your company is taking. We've heard from our executives, and many of them are uncomfortable with the changes you've implemented. They feel like the focus on diversity is taking away from the core business." Victor met his gaze evenly. "I understand your concerns, Charles. But let me ask you this. What kind of company do you want to do business with? One that prioritizes the comfort of a few, or one that values the dignity and respect of all its customers and employees?" Charles frowned. "We're in the business of making money, Victor. Our clients expect the best service, and right now, they're not happy." Victor leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "Service isn't just about making people feel comfortable, Charles. It's about treating everyone with respect, regardless of their background. That's what we're building at this airline, and I believe that's what will set us apart in the long run." There was a long pause as Charles considered Victor's words. "You're asking me to take a risk," Charles said finally. Victor nodded. "Yes, I am. But I believe it's a risk worth taking. We're creating a company that people will be proud to do business with, not just because of our services, but because of our values." For a moment it seemed like Charles might be swayed. But then he shook his head, his expression hardening. "I'm sorry, Victor. We've made our decision." Victor's heart sank, but he kept his composure. "Thank you for your time, Charles," he said, standing up to shake his hand. As Victor left the office, he knew that the loss of Albright Enterprises would have serious consequences. But he also knew that he had done everything he could to stand by his principles. And in the end, that was what mattered most. The loss of Albright Enterprises was a blow, but it wasn't the end. In the months that followed, the airline faced additional challenges, more corporate clients left, profits dipped, and the media continued to scrutinize the company's every move. But despite the setbacks, Victor and Lily persisted. Slowly but surely, the airline's new values began to take root. Employees who had once been skeptical of the diversity and inclusion programs now embraced them. Flight attendants who had resisted the changes started to see the benefits of creating a more inclusive environment for passengers. Customer satisfaction began to improve, and the company's reputation started to recover. More importantly, the airline became a place where employees felt valued and respected, regardless of their background. One afternoon, as Lily was preparing for a training session, she received a message from Victor. "Come to my office," it read. Curious, Lily made her way to Victor's office, where he was sitting at his desk, reviewing the latest reports. "I wanted to show you something," Victor said, handing her a sheet of paper. It was a letter from a passenger, a black woman who had recently flown with the airline. The letter was filled with gratitude. The woman explained how she had always felt uncomfortable flying first class, worried that she didn't belong. But on her last flight, the flight attendants had treated her with kindness and respect, making her feel like she truly belonged. "This is why we do what we do," Victor said, his voice soft but full of conviction. "It's not about the money. It's about making a difference." Lily smiled, feeling a sense of pride and fulfillment she had never felt before. As the airline continued to recover, Victor began to think about the future. He had always known that his time as CEO wouldn't last forever. And now, after years of leading the company through its most challenging period, he felt it was time to step back. In a meeting with the board, Victor announced his decision to retire. The news was met with surprise, but also with respect. Everyone knew that Victor had transformed the airline, not just as a business, but as a place where people were treated with dignity and respect. "I'm leaving the company in good hands," Victor said, his eyes resting on Lily, who had been promoted to a senior leadership position. "The work we've done here is only the beginning. I have no doubt that this company will continue to thrive." As Victor left the boardroom for the last time, he felt a sense of peace. He had fought for what he believed in, and though the journey had been difficult, he knew that the airline was better for it. Epilogue. A new beginning. Several months later, Lily stood in front of a group of new flight attendants, preparing to lead another training session. As she looked out at the eager faces in the room, she couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. She had made mistakes that had nearly cost her everything. But with Victor's guidance, she had turned those mistakes into an opportunity for growth, not just for herself, but for the entire company. As she began the session, she thought about Victor's legacy and the values he had instilled in the airline. His commitment to doing what was right, even when it was hard, had changed the company forever. And now it was up to Lily to carry that legacy forward. "Every interaction we have with a passenger is an opportunity," Lily said, her voice steady and confident. "An opportunity to make someone feel valued, respected, and welcome. Let's make the most of it." The room was silent for a moment, and then one by one, the flight attendants nodded in agreement. The future was bright, and Lily knew that they were all part of something bigger than themselves. As she walked out of the training room, she felt a sense of hope and pride. The journey had been long, but they were finally on the right path. And that was all that mattered. She could see Marcus' frightened face, hear the judgment in the officers' voices. She had never felt so powerless in her life. Samuel stepped back slightly. "Alyssa, is it fair to say that this experience caused you significant emotional distress?" Alyssa nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, thank you, Alyssa," Samuel said softly. No further questions. As Alyssa prepared to step down, Lisa Harding rose from the defense table. Her eyes were sharp as she approached, and Alyssa braced herself for the cross-examination. "Mrs. Grant," Lisa began, her voice cool, "you've stated that the officers made you feel like a criminal. But isn't it true that you refused to cooperate with their requests for additional verification?" Alyssa stiffened. "I didn't refuse to cooperate. I showed them my medical papers, but they ignored them." "But the officers were following protocol." "Correct," Lisa pressed. "They were simply doing their job." Alyssa's anger flared. "Their job wasn't to treat me like I was lying. I did everything I was supposed to do, and they still didn't believe me." Lisa's smile was thin, almost condescending. "So, you felt disrespected. But would you agree that the officers had a responsibility to ensure that the system wasn't being abused?" Alyssa's heart pounded in her chest. She knew what Lisa was doing, trying to twist the narrative, trying to make it seem like the officers had been reasonable. "They had a responsibility to treat me like a human being," Alyssa said, her voice shaking. "But they didn't." Lisa Harding's smile faltered slightly and she stepped back. No further questions. As Alyssa stepped down from the stand, Her legs felt weak. She had spoken her truth, but she wasn't sure if it would be enough. The trial stretched on for several more days, with both sides presenting their arguments. Samuel continued to build a strong case, highlighting the officer's failure to follow proper procedures and the emotional toll the incident had taken on Alyssa and her family. But Lisa Harding and the defense fought back just as hard, trying to paint the officers as professionals simply doing their jobs. By the time the closing statements were made, Alyssa felt emotionally drained. She sat beside Ethan, holding his hand tightly as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict. The room was silent as the judge spoke. After reviewing the evidence and the testimonies provided, it is clear that the officers involved acted inappropriately in their handling of Mrs. Grant's situation. This court finds in favor of the plaintiff. Alyssa's heart skipped a beat as the words sank in. They had won. But the judge's next words tempered her relief. However, while the court recognizes the distress caused, the damages awarded will be limited, as the defense has shown that there was no intent to cause harm. Alyssa exhaled slowly, her emotions a mixture of relief and disappointment. They had won, but it wasn't the complete victory she had hoped for. As the courtroom emptied, Samuel approached Alyssa and Ethan. "We did it," he said with a small smile. "It's not everything we wanted, but it's a step in the right direction." Alyssa nodded, her heart still heavy. She had hoped for more accountability, more justice. But as she looked around at the people who had supported her, she realized that the fight wasn't over. This was just the beginning. Ethan squeezed her hand. "We're going to keep pushing. This isn't the end." Alyssa smiled faintly, feeling a renewed sense of determination. "No, it's not," she agreed. "We've come this far, and we're not stopping now." The days following the trial were a whirlwind of mixed emotions for Alyssa and Ethan. They had won the case, but the limited damages awarded felt like a hollow victory. The media portrayed it as a triumph, but for Alyssa, there was a lingering sense of unfinished business. The police department issued a short statement, acknowledging the court's decision, but refused to accept any direct blame. There was no public apology, no disciplinary actions against the officers involved, just silence, as if the whole ordeal was something they wanted to forget. Ethan tried to stay positive, constantly reminding Alyssa of the progress they had made. "We forced them to acknowledge their mistake," he said, one evening, as they sat together in the living room. "That's something." Alyssa nodded, but her heart was heavy. "It doesn't feel like enough," she admitted. "We went through all of that, and they still get to walk away like it didn't matter." Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder. "It mattered.
It mattered to the people who saw what happened and the people who are standing with us now."
This is bigger than just one case." Alyssa knew he was right. The outpouring of support from the community had been overwhelming. Messages of encouragement flooded her social media, and people she had never met reached out to thank her for standing up against injustice. Tanya, who had been a constant source of support throughout the ordeal, visited them often. "We've opened the door for change," she said during one of her visits. "The fight isn't over, but you've made people listen." Still, the weight of what they had been through lingered. Alyssa felt exhausted, both physically and emotionally. She hadn't fully processed the toll the trial had taken on her, and the public scrutiny that followed didn't help. There were still hateful comments online, people who insisted that she had overreacted, that she was trying to make something out of nothing. But Alyssa refused to let the negativity silence her. She had come too far to back down now. A few weeks after the trial, Samuel Green contacted Alyssa and Ethan with some surprising news. A civil rights organization had taken notice of their case and wanted to partner with them in pushing for broader reform. They were calling for changes in police training, particularly around how officers handle interactions with people of color and those with disabilities. "We're going to push for systemic changes," Samuel explained during their meeting. The lawsuit was just the first step. Now we need to focus on changing the policies that allow things like this to happen in the first place. Alyssa felt a flicker of hope. This was exactly what she had wanted, the chance to prevent others from going through what she had experienced. Tanya was equally enthusiastic. "Well, organize another rally," she said, her eyes alight with determination. "This time, we're not just demanding justice for you. We're demanding changes that will protect everyone." The rally, held in front of the courthouse, drew even larger crowds than the first one. Alyssa stood at the center of it all, feeling the energy of the people around her, people who believed in what she was fighting for, people who wanted to see real change. This time, Alyssa felt stronger. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the countless others who had been silenced, ignored, and mistreated. As she took the stage to speak, the crowd quieted. Alyssa's voice rang out clear and steady. "I stood here months ago to tell you my story. Today, I'm here to tell you that the fight for justice isn't over. It's not just about what happened to me. It's about what happens every day to people who look like me, people who live with disabilities, people who are treated like they don't belong." The crowd cheered, their voices rising in support. "We deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, no matter who we are or where we come from," Alyssa continued. And we won't stop until the system changes, until officers are held accountable, until our communities feel safe, and until everyone is seen for who they are, not just the assumptions made about them. As the rally continued, Alyssa felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew there was still a long road ahead, but she also knew she wasn't walking it alone. In the months that followed, Alyssa and Ethan's lives slowly began to return to a sense of normalcy. The teenagers exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable under Jake's stern gaze. But Alyssa's fight for justice didn't end, it simply shifted. She and Ethan became advocates, speaking at events, partnering with civil rights organizations, and working with local lawmakers to push for reforms in police training. Their case became a touchstone for broader conversations about race, disability, and the treatment of marginalized communities. For Alyssa, the most important change was within herself. She had gone from feeling powerless to finding her voice, and now she was using that voice to help others. Her strength, which had been tested in ways she never imagined, had only grown stronger. One evening, as Alyssa and Ethan sat on the porch watching Marcus play in the yard, she felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for so long. I didn't think we'd get here, Alyssa said quietly, leaning her head against Ethan's shoulder. Ethan smiled, wrapping his arm around her. We've come a long way. Alyssa watched Marcus laugh and run, her heart swelling with love for him. Do you think he'll remember what happened? She asked softly. Ethan thought for a moment. Maybe. But if he does, he'll remember how strong you were, how you stood up for yourself and for him. Alyssa smiled, wiping a tear from her cheek. I just want him to know that we did the right thing. He knows, Ethan said gently. We all know. Months turned into a year. And while the initial urgency of the trial had passed, the changes that Alyssa and Ethan had fought for were starting to take root. The police department, under pressure from the public and local leaders, began implementing new training. It wasn't a complete overhaul, but it was a step in the right direction. Alyssa and Ethan continued to speak out, using their platform to raise awareness and push for further reforms. They met with other families who had experienced similar injustices, offering support and guidance. One day, as Alyssa was preparing for another speaking event, she received an unexpected call from the police department's new chief, who had been brought in after the fallout from the trial. I wanted to reach out to you personally, the chief said, his tone respectful. I know the department has a long way to go, but I want you to know that we're committed to making things better. What happened to you should never have happened, and we're working to ensure it doesn't happen again. Alyssa was taken aback by the call. It wasn't a formal apology, but it was the closest thing to acknowledgement she had received from the department since the trial. Thank you, Alyssa replied, her voice steady. I appreciate that. But I'll be watching closely to make sure those changes happen. The chief chuckled lightly. I wouldn't expect anything less. As Alyssa hung up the phone, she felt a sense of closure that had been missing for so long. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt like real progress was being made. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Alyssa, Ethan, and Marcus returned to Greenview Amusement Park. It had been over a year since the confrontation, and though Alyssa had been reluctant to return, Ethan had convinced her that it was time to reclaim the space that had once brought them so much pain. As they walked through the gates, Alyssa felt a mix of emotions. Memories of that day flooded her mind, but alongside them came a sense of strength. She had faced her fear, fought for justice, and emerged stronger on the other side. Mom, can we go on the Ferris wheel? Marcus asked, his voice filled with excitement. Alyssa smiled down at him, her heart swelling with pride. Of course we can, she said. Let's go. As they approached the ride, Alyssa noticed the park had made some changes. The accessibility lines were more clearly marked, and staff members greeted them with warmth and respect. It was a small but significant Victoria sign that slowly but surely things were changing. As the Ferris wheel lifted them into the sky, Alyssa looked out over the park, the sun casting a warm glow over the landscape. She glanced at Ethan, who smiled back at her, and then at Marcus, whose laughter filled the air. In that moment, Alyssa felt a deep sense of peace. She had fought for herself, for her family, and for justice. And while the fight was far from over, she knew they were heading in the right direction. They had faced the odds and emerged stronger, and now, together, they looked to the future with hope. The story of Alyssa and Ethan's fight for justice became a symbol of hope and resilience. It wasn't just about one incident, it was about standing up against a system that too often overlooked the people it was meant to protect. Their story inspired others to come forward, to share their own experiences, and to demand better from the institutions that were supposed to serve them. Alyssa's journey wasn't easy, but in the end, she had found her strength, not just for herself, but for her family and her community. And while the fight for justice continued, Alyssa knew that together they could make a difference. Thank you for watching this powerful story. If Alyssa's journey for justice and resilience inspired you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that spark hope and bring light to issues that matter. Hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next upload, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters in the ongoing fight for change. Stay tuned for more stories that uplift, inspire, and push for a better tomorrow. He paused, locking eyes with the jury. We have a chance today to show that Silver Creek is a place where everyone is valued, where justice prevails. Let's not waste that chance. The jury's decision, when it came, was a victory for Ethan's client and for the town as a whole. The verdict sent a clear message: Silver Creek was ready to move forward, to embrace the values of equality and justice that Ethan and Nia had fought so hard for. The victory in the courtroom marked the beginning of a new chapter for Silver Creek. Slowly but surely, the town was becoming a place where people felt safe to speak out, to stand up for what they believed in. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, still pockets of resistance, but the progress was undeniable. Ethan and Nia, though still facing challenges, felt a sense of peace they hadn't known in a long time. They had fought for their love, for justice, and for the future of Silver Creek, and now they were seeing the fruits of their labor. One evening, as they sat together on their porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Ethan turned to Nia, a soft smile on his lips. "You know," he said, his voice filled with affection, "when I first met you, I had no idea how much my life would change." Nia chuckled, resting her head on his shoulder. "You had no idea how much you'd change mine." Ethan wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "We've come so far. Sometimes I still can't believe everything we've been through." Nia nodded, her heart full. "It hasn't been easy, but I wouldn't trade it for anything." As they sat together, the quiet of the evening surrounding them, Nia thought about the journey they had been on, the battles they had fought, the love they had shared, and the future they had helped create. Silver Creek was changing, and so were they. A few weeks later, the community held a town-wide celebration to honor the progress that had been made. The event, organized by Nia and Martha Sullivan, was a way to bring everyone together, to celebrate the town's journey toward inclusion and justice. The celebration was held in the town square, where people from all walks of life gathered, young and old, black and white, conservative and progressive. It was a symbol of how far Silver Creek had come, and a reminder that the town's future was something everyone could help shape. As the sun set over the square, Ethan and Nia stood together on the main stage, looking out at the crowd. The atmosphere was warm and joyful, filled with laughter and music. It was a moment of triumph, a testament to the power of love, community, and perseverance. Martha Sullivan took the microphone, her voice carrying across the square. "Tonight, we're celebrating more than just the progress we've made. We're celebrating the people who made that progress possible, people like Ethan and Nia, who showed us what it means to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard." The crowd erupted in applause, and Nia felt tears prick the corners of her eyes. She hadn't done this for recognition, but hearing the town come together in support of the changes they had fought for filled her with a sense of pride and fulfillment. As the night wore on, Ethan and Nia danced together under the stars, surrounded by friends, family, and neighbors. The future, once uncertain, now felt bright with possibility. And though there were still challenges ahead, they knew they would face them together, just as they always had. As the years passed, Silver Creek continued to evolve, becoming a beacon of hope for other towns grappling with the same struggles. Ethan and Nia's love story became part of the town's legacy, a symbol of what could be achieved when people refused to back down in the face of adversity. Their journey wasn't just about love. It was about standing up for justice, for fairness, and for the belief that everyone, no matter their background, deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. In the end, Silver Creek had become a place where people from all walks of life could live, love, and grow. And though the road had been long and hard, it had been worth every step. Ethan and Nia, together, had built a legacy of love and hope, one that would endure for generations to come. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more about love, justice, and the power of standing up for what's right, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. By subscribing, you'll stay updated on all our latest content. Thanks for your support, and remember, love and justice always prevail. He stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the world beyond. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the yard. It was a beautiful day, full of possibility. And as Derek looked out, he felt a deep sense of hope for the future, not just for himself and his family, but for the world they were all helping to shape. Mia and Marcus ran into the room, their laughter filling the air as they played a game of tag around the furniture. Jessica followed close behind, her smile bright and warm. Derek turned away from the window and watched his family, feeling a deep sense of contentment. They were his reason for everything, for standing tall in the face of adversity, for sharing his story, for doing his part to make the world a better place. And as he looked at their faces, full of love and laughter, Derek knew that the future was bright. It wouldn't always be easy, but it was full of potential, full of opportunities to learn, to grow, and to create a world where empathy and understanding prevailed. In the end, that was all he could ask for. As the day wound down, Derek sat back at his desk, reflecting on everything that had transpired over the last few months. From the confrontation at the electronics store to the inspiring conversations with young people, he had witnessed firsthand how one small action could create lasting change. Every step forward mattered. He logged into his blog and drafted another post, this time focusing on the idea of speaking out, of standing up for what's right. He knew there was more work to do, always more people to reach, more stories to tell. But he felt confident that he was on the right path. As Derek prepared to hit publish, he paused, thinking of everyone who had been following his journey. If you've been inspired by this story and want to be part of a community that stands up for empathy, justice, and change, don't forget to subscribe to the blog. Join the conversation, share your thoughts, and stay tuned for more stories about making a difference one step at a time. Together, we can build a future that's brighter for everyone. Satisfied, Derek hit the publish button and leaned back in his chair. The work wasn't done, but with every new subscriber, every person who read and connected with his message, he knew they were getting closer to the world they all deserved. And that was worth everything. Jason looked out at the horizon, the sun setting over the rooftops of the homes they had helped create. This is what it's all about, isn't it? Mia smiled, leaning into him. Yes, it is. They stood there, hand in hand, knowing that they had left a legacy of hope and change. Their fight for housing justice wasn't over, but they had come so far, and the future was brighter than ever. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more about inspiring journeys, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, so you never miss an update on the latest stories of change, justice, and hope. Subscribe today and join us as we continue to explore stories that make a difference. The company had to choose a side. Either it stood for the values of fairness and inclusion, or it would continue to enable discriminatory practices. We're prepared to take this to court, Olivia said, her tone firm. But we'd prefer to resolve this internally, with full accountability and corrective action. Jenna Riley's actions have been damaging to both the company and its passengers. It's time for her to take responsibility. Jenna's lawyer, Robert, leaned forward, his voice firm but clearly on the defensive. Ms. Brooks, Miss Carter, I think we can all agree that this situation has been difficult for everyone involved. But let's not lose sight of the fact that Jenna was acting within her role as a flight attendant, trying to ensure the safety and comfort of all passengers. Ava cut him off again, her patience wearing thin. No, Mr. Marston. This isn't about safety or comfort. This is about respect, about human dignity, and the fact that you're still trying to frame it otherwise tells me you don't understand the gravity of what's happening here. She turned her gaze back to Jenna, her voice softening but still carrying the weight of her conviction. Jenna, I'm giving you the opportunity to own up to what you did.
To admit that what happened on that flight and in other instances it was wrong.
This is your chance to make things right, not just for me, but for everyone who has been affected by your actions. For a moment the room was silent. Jenna's face was tense, her fingers gripping the arms of her chair. Ava could see the internal battle playing out in her eyes, the fear of losing everything she had worked for, the stubbornness of not wanting to admit fault, and perhaps, just beneath the surface, the faint flicker of remorse. Jenna's lawyer leaned in to whisper something to her, but Ava could see that the real struggle was happening within Jenna herself. After what felt like an eternity, Jenna finally spoke, her voice low and unsteady. I didn't mean to hurt anyone, Jenna said, her eyes downcast. I was just trying to do my job. Ava didn't respond immediately, allowing Jenna to continue. I've worked for this airline for years, and I always thought I was doing the right thing, Jenna said, her voice breaking slightly. But I see now that I wasn't thinking about how my actions affected people. I was wrong. Ava remained silent, waiting. Really bad. Jenna looked up, meeting Ava's eyes for the first time. I'm sorry, Ava. I really am. I didn't see it before, but I do now. And I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. Ava nodded, the weight of the moment settling in her chest. Jenna's apology was far from perfect, and there was still a long road ahead. But it was a start. A necessary step toward accountability and healing. We'll discuss the terms of a resolution, Olivia said, her voice cutting through the silence. But we expect full cooperation moving forward. This isn't just about closing the case, it's about making sure that this never happens again. Jenna nodded, her shoulders slumping slightly as the reality of the situation sank in. Her lawyer remained quiet, clearly aware that the fight had shifted in Ava's favor. Ava glanced at David and the other executives, who were still processing the gravity of what had just unfolded. There was no going back now. The company had reached a crossroads, and Ava had made it clear which path they would be taking. This isn't the end, Ava said quietly, addressing the room. It's the beginning of something better. We're going to rebuild this company from the ground up, And that starts with owning our mistakes and making real changes. The meeting adjourned shortly after, and as the others filed out of the room, Ava remained seated for a moment, letting the quiet settle around her. It wasn't victory, not yet. There was still so much work to be done. But it was a step forward. A step toward creating a culture that truly reflected the values she had always believed in. As Olivia packed up the last of the documents, she looked over at Ava, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "You did it, Ava. We're moving in the right direction." Ava exhaled slowly, nodding. "We are, but we're not done yet." Ava Brooks sat in the quiet of her office, watching the early morning light filter through the glass windows. The confrontation with Jenna Riley had been a turning point, but now the real work began, the aftermath. The company was poised on the edge of a transformation, and Ava could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. This wasn't just about her personal vindication. It was about changing an entire system. The previous week had been a whirlwind of meetings and difficult conversations. Jenna's public apology, though far from perfect, had sent ripples through the airline. For the first time, employees were openly talking about the culture that had silently permeated the company for years. Some were uncomfortable with the shift, while others, particularly those who had quietly suffered, began to feel hopeful that real change was coming. Ava's phone buzzed on her desk, breaking her from her thoughts. It was a message from Olivia. "Court ruled in our favor. Formal settlement agreement being drafted. We can discuss terms today." Ava's heart skipped a beat. They had won. After months of legal battles, emotional strain, and seemingly endless meetings, the court had ruled in their favor. Jenna Riley would face formal consequences for her actions, and the airline would be held accountable for its role in allowing discriminatory behavior to persist. But more importantly, this legal victory meant that the reforms Ava had been pushing for could no longer be brushed aside. Ava leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment as the weight of the news settled in. It wasn't just about the legal victory, it was about the validation of everything she had fought for. The truth had been laid bare, and now the company had no choice but to move forward with the comprehensive changes she had envisioned. Later that afternoon, Ava and Olivia met with the airline's legal and executive teams to finalize the terms of the settlement. David Harrington, the chief operating officer, sat across from them, looking more composed than he had in previous weeks. Ava could sense that the reality of the situation had finally sunk in for him. The time for resistance had passed. It was time to rebuild. Olivia, ever the professional, laid out the terms in a calm, precise manner. As part of the settlement, the airline will implement mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all employees, starting at the executive level and extending to every member of staff, from flight attendants to ground crew. David nodded, though his expression remained neutral. Ava could tell he still harbored some concerns about the financial impact of the reforms, but he also understood that there was no turning back. "We'll also be reviewing the complaint process," Olivia continued. "Every report of discrimination or mistreatment will be thoroughly investigated, and no complaints will be dismissed without a full review by an independent committee." David shifted slightly in his seat, his eyes meeting Ava's. "Ava, you know this isn't going to be easy. Implementing these changes across the entire company will take time and resources." Ava nodded, her voice steady. "I understand that, David. But doing the right thing isn't always easy. This is about more than just protecting the company from legal consequences. It's about creating a culture where everyone is treated with respect, where every passenger and employee feels safe and valued." David sighed but nodded in agreement. "You're right. We should have addressed this a long time ago." Olivia continued with the rest of the terms. Jenna Riley would be placed on leave, pending further investigation, and the company would make a public commitment to addressing systemic discrimination. The airline would also provide compensation to affected employees and passengers who had come forward with complaints. When the meeting concluded, Ava felt a sense of closure beginning to take root. It wasn't about punishment or retribution. This was about making sure that what had happened to her and to others like her would never happen again. In the days that followed, the news of the settlement broke, sparking a media frenzy. Headlines splashed across newspapers and news sites. "Airline settles in discrimination case, major reforms on the way." CEO Ava Brooks leads fight for corporate accountability. Airline faces reckoning after racial discrimination lawsuit. For the first time, Ava wasn't anxious about the media attention. This was the story she wanted out there, a story about transformation, about owning up to mistakes and pushing for a better future. The narrative had shifted from a scandal to one of accountability and growth. The public response was overwhelmingly supportive. Messages flooded in from across the world, customers, employees, and even people who had never flown with the airline, thanking Ava for standing up, for refusing to let the issue be swept under the rug. Some shared their own stories of being mistreated or overlooked, inspired by Ava's determination to fight back. But Ava's focus was already on the future. The reforms were being rolled out across the company, starting with the senior leadership team. The diversity and inclusion training sessions were designed not just as a formality, but as a real opportunity for change. The program would include practical workshops where employees would learn how their unconscious biases could affect their work and how to create a more inclusive environment for all passengers. Ava personally oversaw the training for the executive team, determined to ensure that the changes started at the top. She stood at the front of the room, addressing the group of senior leaders, some of whom had been with the company since its inception. "This is where the real work begins," Ava said, her voice strong but filled with purpose. "It's not enough to implement policies. We have to live them. We have to show our employees, our customers, and the world that we're committed to being better." There were murmurs of agreement around the room, but Ava knew that words were only the beginning. Action was what mattered now. Real change required commitment, and she was prepared to lead that charge. A few weeks later, as the dust settled and the company began to adjust to the new changes, Ava found herself sitting in her office once again, looking out at the city skyline. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the buildings. The long journey, filled with emotional highs and lows, was finally beginning to pay off. Her phone buzzed with a message from Olivia. "Training sessions going well. Staff feedback is positive so far. We're making progress." Ava smiled, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction. The path had been difficult, but every step had been worth it. The culture of the airline was shifting, little by little, toward one of fairness and respect. There was still much work to be done, but the foundation had been laid. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Christine Larkin, the former flight attendant who had come forward with her testimony. She had recently rejoined the airline in a new role, part of the newly formed Diversity and Inclusion Committee. "Ava, do you have a minute?" Christine asked, stepping into the office. "Of course," Ava replied, motioning for her to sit. Christine smiled, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and pride. "I just wanted to thank you for everything. I never thought I'd have the courage to speak up, but you made that possible. And now things are really changing." Ava's smile widened. "You don't have to thank me, Christine. You're the one who had the courage to come forward. This change, it's because of all of us." Christine nodded, her eyes shining with emotion. "I've been talking to some of the newer flight attendants, and they're already noticing a difference. People are more aware, more mindful of how they treat passengers. It's a start, but it's a good one." Ava leaned back in her chair, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe. The airline was on the path to becoming the company she had always envisioned, a place where everyone, regardless of who they were or what they looked like, was treated with dignity and respect. "We've come a long way," Ava said softly, "but we're not done yet." Christine nodded in agreement. "No, we're not. But at least now, we're moving in the right direction." Months had passed since the settlement was finalized, and the airline was slowly but surely transforming. The diversity and inclusion initiatives had expanded beyond training sessions to include mentorship programs, employee resource groups, and a new system for handling complaints that ensured every issue was addressed with transparency and accountability. Ava had made sure to stay deeply involved in the process, regularly meeting with staff and listening to their feedback. She knew that real change wasn't something that could be mandated from the top. It had to be cultivated from within, nurtured by every employee. On one particular morning, Ava found herself on a flight, this time as a passenger, seated in first class once again. But this flight felt different. The atmosphere was lighter, the staff friendlier. As she looked around, she noticed something she hadn't seen on her previous flights: diversity. The crew was made up of people from various backgrounds, and the passengers reflected the same diversity. A flight attendant approached her, smiling warmly. "Ms. Brooks, can I get you anything?" Ava smiled back, feeling a sense of pride in how far the company had come. "Just some water, thank you." As the flight attendant walked away, Ava leaned back in her seat, gazing out the window at the clouds rolling by. The fight had been long and hard, but the reward was clear: a company that had embraced change, that had grown stronger because of it. Ava knew that the journey wasn't over. There would always be challenges, always more work to be done. But for now, she could rest easy, knowing that she had made a real difference, not just for herself, but for countless others. As the plane soared through the sky, Ava felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The airline she had built was finally living up to the vision she had always dreamed of, one where everyone had a seat at the table, and everyone was treated with the respect they deserved. And in that moment, Ava knew that she had truly won. Ava Brooks never sought recognition. In her heart, she had always believed that real change didn't need the spotlight. It needed dedication, persistence, and the courage to stand up when it mattered most. As the months turned into a year since the settlement, her life had settled into a new rhythm. The airline had undergone a transformation that extended beyond its policies. It had reshaped its identity. And while Ava felt a deep sense of accomplishment, she knew there was still more to be done. One crisp autumn morning, Ava was invited to speak at a national conference on corporate responsibility and diversity. The event had drawn leaders from various industries, eager to discuss how businesses could not only survive, but thrive by fostering inclusive environments. As Ava stood backstage, reviewing her notes, she reflected on how far she had come and how far the company had come, thanks to the battle she had fought. "Ava, you're up in 5, Olivia said, coming up beside her with a reassuring smile. Ava nodded, feeling a familiar surge of energy as she prepared to step into the limelight. She wasn't one for grand speeches, but this was different. This was a moment where she could share her story and inspire others to take the same steps, to hold their own companies accountable, and foster a culture where everyone felt valued. As the conference host introduced her, Ava took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. The bright lights of the auditorium illuminated the hundreds of faces watching her intently, but she wasn't nervous. She was ready. "Good morning," Ava began, her voice strong yet warm. "Thank you for having me here today. I want to start by saying that change doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen because one person decides it's time. It happens when a collective force within a company, a community, or a society says enough is enough." The audience was silent, their attention fixed on Ava as she continued. "A little over a year ago, I stood in the same position many of you are in, now leading a company, grappling with complex issues, and faced with a decision that would define not just my business, but who I was as a leader. The story many of you know began with a single flight. A flight where I, a black woman, a CEO, was made to feel like I didn't belong in a seat I had rightfully paid for. But that flight was just the catalyst." Ava paused, letting the weight of her words settle in. "What followed was a journey of accountability, one where I and my team had to confront the uncomfortable truth that even the company I had built had allowed a toxic culture to take root. It wasn't easy. There were moments when I wanted to step back, moments when I questioned whether the fight was worth it, but it was worth it. Because it wasn't just about me, it was about every person who had ever felt marginalized, dismissed, or disrespected because of who they were or how they looked." The audience remained silent, hanging on to every word. The auditorium was packed, the hum of conversation filling the air as Marcus stood backstage, waiting for his turn to speak. "We've implemented diversity and inclusion training across every level of our company, restructured our complaint processes to ensure that no voice goes unheard, and fostered an environment where our employees and passengers know that they are valued. But I'm not here to talk about our success. I'm here to challenge you all to look within your own organizations. Because the truth is, this issue isn't isolated to one company, one industry, or one country." A few heads nodded in agreement. Ava could feel the connection she was building with the room. "This isn't just about doing what's good for business, though. Let me assure you, it is good for business. It's about doing what's right. It's about standing for something, even when it's difficult, even when it's uncomfortable. As leaders, we have the power to create environments where everyone, regardless of race, gender, background, or status, feels like they belong." Ava took another breath, softening her tone as she prepared to close. "It took one moment, one incident, to start the change within my company. But it took the commitment of many, my legal team, my employees, my fellow leaders, to see that change through. I ask each of you today to go back to your organizations and ask yourself, what kind of culture am I building? And is it one where every person feels respected?" They had lived it too. The lights dimmed slightly, and the conference host returned to the stage, thanking Ava for her powerful words. As she walked off stage, Olivia was there to greet her, smiling with pride. "You were incredible," Olivia said, giving Ava a light pat on the back. "You might not love public speaking, but you have a gift for it." Ava laughed softly. "I just spoke from the heart. Hopefully, it makes a difference." Olivia nodded. "It will. Believe me, it will." Back at the office, life had settled into a new normal. Ava continued to oversee the company's transformation, but she had also shifted her focus to broader initiatives, helping other businesses implement the same reforms she had championed within her airline. Her work was no longer confined to her own company. She had become a voice for change across industries, a role model for other leaders who wanted to create inclusive environments. A few days after the conference, Ava received an unexpected email. It was from Jenna Riley. "Ava, I hope this message finds you well. I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened over the past year. It's taken me a long time to process, but I wanted to reach out to thank you. Not for what happened, but for showing me what accountability looks like. I've been doing a lot of reflecting, and I've started working on myself. I've enrolled in a course on cultural sensitivity and inclusion, and am taking steps to understand how my actions affected you and others. I realize now that I was part of the problem, and for that, I am truly sorry. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I'm committed to becoming better. I hope that in time, I can be part of the solution. Thank you again, Jenna. Ava read the email twice, absorbing Jenna's words. It was clear that Jenna had gone through her own journey of self-reflection, a journey Ava had never expected her to take. Ava had already moved past the pain of that flight, but reading Jenna's message gave her a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed. It wasn't about forgiveness. It was about knowing that change, real change, was possible, even for those who had been part of the problem. Ava replied simply, I appreciate your message, Jenna. Wishing you the best on your journey. As the months rolled on, Ava's work continued to expand. She partnered with nonprofits focused on workplace diversity, spoke at universities, and even sat down with government officials to discuss policies that would encourage corporate accountability. Her airline had become a model for other companies looking to reform their practices, and Ava had become a leader not just in business, but in the fight for social justice. One evening, as she sat in her penthouse apartment, sipping tea and looking out at the city skyline, Ava felt a profound sense of peace. She had been through so much, rising from humble beginnings, building a business empire, and fighting against the injustices that had tried to hold her back. But she hadn't just fought for herself. She had fought for something larger, something that would outlast her. Her phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from Olivia. We're receiving another award for our diversity initiatives. Congratulations, Ava. Your work is being recognized everywhere. Ava smiled softly, her heart full. She had never sought the accolades, but knowing that her efforts were making a difference filled her with pride. Her journey wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, Ava felt that she had truly found her purpose. She wasn't just a businesswoman. She was a change-maker, someone who had taken the pain of her experiences and turned it into something powerful, something that would continue to ripple through the world long after her work was done. As Ava gazed out at the lights of the city, she whispered softly to herself, thinking of her late mother's words, "Keep going, Ava. Don't give up." And she wouldn't. Not ever. Ava Brooks' journey had taken her to places she never thought possible. The airline's transformation was well underway, and her influence had grown beyond the company she founded. She had become a national figure and advocate for corporate accountability, a voice for inclusion, and a symbol of resilience in the face of adversity. But for Ava, the work wasn't finished. In the months following the conference, Ava received requests to speak at panels, consult with other businesses, and even participate in discussions with lawmakers on the broader implications of diversity and inclusion in the workplace. She was excited, but also keenly aware that real change required more than just speeches, it required concrete action. One of the organizations that had been watching Ava's work closely was a leading civil rights group, the National Equity Initiative. Their mission was to promote systemic reforms in companies across the country, and they saw Ava as the ideal partner to help push forward a major campaign that would aim to enforce stronger policies around corporate discrimination. Ava received a personal invitation from the organization's president, Dr. Teresa Gardner, to meet and discuss how they could collaborate. Ava walked into the sleek offices of the National Equity Initiative, greeted warmly by Dr. Gardner herself. Teresa was a formidable woman, known for her deep knowledge of civil rights law and her relentless pursuit of justice. She had spent decades in the fight for racial and gender equality and had a reputation for creating long-lasting impact. "It's such a pleasure to finally meet you, Ava," Teresa said with a wide smile, shaking Ava's hand. "I've followed your journey with great admiration." "The pleasure is mine, Dr. Gardner," Ava replied, grateful for the opportunity. "I've been inspired by the work you've done. I think we can do something really meaningful together." They sat down in a bright conference room, its walls lined with framed photos of civil rights leaders. Teresa wasted no time diving into the heart of their meeting. "Ava, your work with the airline has set a precedent. You've demonstrated that one person can make a difference, and that corporate culture can be transformed. What we're trying to do is take that model and make it applicable to every industry. We need businesses across the country to adopt these reforms, not just because it's good PR, but because it's necessary for a just society." Ava nodded, completely in sync with the vision. "I agree. The changes we made at the airline are just the beginning. There are so many companies that have deep-rooted problems, and those won't be fixed by surface-level training sessions. It's going to take systemic reform." Teresa smiled, clearly pleased with Ava's passion. "Exactly. That's why we want you to help lead our new initiative. We're calling it the Corporate Accountability Project, or CAP. The goal is to work directly with CEOs, HR departments, and government officials to draft industry-wide guidelines for diversity, equity, and inclusion. We want to create a blueprint that businesses across the country can follow." Ava's heart quickened with excitement. This was what she had been working toward all along, a chance to take her personal fight and expand it on a national level. "I'm in," she said without hesitation. "I want to be part of this." That's the spirit. The Corporate Accountability Project gained momentum quickly, attracting interest from major corporations, lawmakers, and nonprofit organizations alike. Ava's role involved meeting with corporate leaders, sharing her own experiences, and helping them understand the importance of deep, structural change. One of her first major meetings was with Dan Matthews, the CEO of a major tech company that had been facing criticism for its lack of diversity in leadership. The company had struggled to attract and retain employees from marginalized backgrounds, and its internal culture had been called into question after several high-profile resignations. Dan greeted Ava warmly when she arrived at the tech company's headquarters, but she could tell that he was nervous. Like many CEOs, he was concerned about how the public perceived his company, and how the changes Ava was suggesting might affect his bottom line. "Look, Ava," Dan began as they sat down, "I get it. Diversity is important, and we've made some efforts, but it's hard. Our industry moves fast, and sometimes it feels like we don't have the luxury of focusing on these kinds of initiatives when we're just trying to stay competitive." Ava smiled, understanding the pressure Dan was under. But she wasn't going to let him off the hook. "Dan, I know you're trying to run a successful business. People look at me differently because of how I look, because of where my family is from." Dan's eyes flickered, and Ava could see that her words were resonating. She leaned in, her voice calm but firm. "You don't have to choose between success and diversity. In fact, the two go hand in hand. The more diverse perspectives you have in the room, the more innovative your company will be. But you have to be willing to do the work, real meaningful work. And that starts with leadership. It starts with you." Dan sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "You're right. I know you're right. I guess I need help figuring out how to get there." Ava smiled, feeling the familiar sense of satisfaction that came with knowing she was making a difference. "That's why I'm here." The Corporate Accountability Project began gaining traction in other industries as well: finance, healthcare, retail. Ava worked tirelessly with CEOs and executives to create individualized plans that would foster diversity and inclusion within their ranks. Each company had its own challenges, but Ava's approach was always the same: be direct, be honest, and be committed to change. Meanwhile, Ava's airline continued to thrive. The changes she had implemented were yielding positive results, with employee satisfaction at an all-time high and passenger complaint related to discrimination significantly reduced. The company's reputation had not only recovered, but had been strengthened by its commitment to inclusivity. Investors, once wary of the costs of reform, were now praising the airline's progressive stance and seeing the financial benefits of a happy, engaged workforce. Ava's schedule was relentless, but the rewards were undeniable. She had become more than just a CEO. She was a symbol of corporate reform, a leader who had turned her personal experience into a national movement. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Ava returned to her office and found an invitation waiting for her on her desk. It was from the White House. She opened the elegant envelope and read the message inside. "Dear Ms. Brooks, the President of the United States requests the honor of your presence at a roundtable discussion on corporate diversity and inclusion to be held at the White House next month. Your leadership and contributions to this important issue have made a significant impact, and we would be honored to have your voice in this conversation." Ava sat down stunned. She had never imagined that her journey would take her this far. From fighting a single battle on a flight to being invited to the White House to discuss national policies on corporate accountability, it was more than she had ever dreamed of. As she sat in the quiet of her office, the weight of the invitation settled in. This was no longer just about her airline, or even about the companies she had worked with through the Corporate Accountability Project. This was about shaping the future of the entire country's approach to diversity, inclusion, and fairness in the workplace. Ava picked up the phone and called Olivia. "You're not going to believe this," she said, a smile spreading across her face. "I just got invited to the White House." As Ava walked out of her office that day, the sun shining brightly above her, she felt a deep sense of peace. She had spent her life fighting for what she believed in, and now she could see the fruits of that labor everywhere she looked. Her legacy wasn't just in the companies she had transformed, or the policies she had helped implement. It was in the lives she had touched, the people who had found their voices, who had broken through barriers, and who were now carrying the torch forward. Ava smiled as she stepped into the bustling street, knowing that her work would live on through the countless leaders she had inspired. This was her legacy, a world where everyone had the opportunity to thrive, where diversity was celebrated, and where accountability was the foundation of every successful business. And even though the work was far from over, Ava knew that she had made a lasting difference. If you've been inspired by Ava's journey and want to hear more stories about leadership, accountability, and creating positive change in the world, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Together, we can continue spreading the message of inclusion and fairness, and help build a world where everyone has the opportunity to succeed. Stay tuned for more stories of transformation and leadership, because real change begins with us. Hit that subscribe button and don't miss out on the next chapter of this incredible journey. It's about a system that has been built to ignore the needs of people of color. It's about a culture that allows bias to go unchecked, because it's easier to look the other way. The audience was silent, their attention fully on Marcus. But we can change that, he continued. We've seen it happen before. When we come together, when we hold institutions accountable, we can make real progress. But it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take sustained effort, and it's going to take all of us. When Marcus finished his speech, the applause was thunderous. He had become more than just a survivor of discrimination. He was now a leader in the fight to dismantle the very systems that had harmed him, and so many others. Later that evening, the other victims who had come forward to share their stories. Each of them had played a part in this fight, and each of them had helped to push the needle of justice forward, even if just a little. Marcus pulled out his notebook, a habit he had developed during the lawsuit, where he jotted down thoughts and reflections. He opened to a blank page and began to write. Change is slow, but it's happening. Every fight, every voice, every story, it all adds up. I never wanted to be the face of anything, but now that I'm here, I can't turn back. We can't turn back. The fight for justice is hard, but it's the only fight worth having. He closed the notebook, feeling a sense of calm wash over him. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt at peace with where it was leading him. The more Marcus involved himself in national advocacy, the more he realized that systemic change required collaboration between different sectors of society. The fight for racial justice in healthcare couldn't be won by lawsuits alone, needed the engagement of doctors, nurses, policymakers, and, most importantly, the communities that had been most affected. One of the most significant moments in Marcus' journey came when he was invited to attend a summit on healthcare reform hosted by the American Medical Association, AMA. Healthcare leaders from across the country were gathering to discuss how to address racial disparities in patient care. And Marcus had been asked to participate in a panel alongside healthcare professionals and other advocates. Walking into the Grand Conference Hall in Chicago, Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of both awe and apprehension. The stakes felt higher than ever. He wasn't just fighting for his own justice anymore, he was pushing for a transformation of the entire healthcare system. And now he would be standing alongside some of the most powerful voices in the field. As the panel discussion began, Marcus listened carefully to the doctors and policy experts who spoke before him. They talked about the data, the studies that showed how patients of color were less likely to receive adequate care, how their pain was often underestimated, how their symptoms were dismissed. But what was missing from the conversation, Marcus realized, was the human side, the lived experiences of the people who had suffered because of these biases. When it was his turn to speak, Marcus stood and took a deep breath. He could feel the eyes of the room on him, and once again, that familiar nervousness crept up his spine. But he had learned to harness that feeling. I've heard a lot of great ideas here today, Marcus began, his voice steady but passionate. But we can't forget the people who live this every day. The people who walk into clinics and hospitals and pharmacies and feel like they're not being seen. I'm not a doctor, but I am someone who has lived through this. I've been treated like a criminal for doing nothing more than asking for the same treatment anyone else would get. And that experience isn't unique to me. The room was silent, and Marcus could see that his words were hitting their mark. We can talk about policy and data all day, Marcus continued. But if we don't acknowledge the real stories, the real people behind those numbers, we'll never get anywhere. What we need is to build bridges between healthcare providers and the communities they serve, between those in power and those who've been silenced. We need empathy, we need understanding, and we need accountability. The applause that followed was polite but genuine. As Marcus sat down, he knew that the fight ahead would be just as tough as the battles he'd already fought. But he also knew he wasn't alone anymore. He was working with people who shared his vision for a better, more equitable future. The national advocacy work had taken Marcus across the country, from Washington, D.C.
To Chicago, to state capitals where he met with local lawmakers.
But through it all, Riverton remained his anchor. No matter how far his fight took him, he always came back home. On one of his returns to Riverton, Marcus was surprised to see just how much had changed in the years since his court victory. The small town had started its own conversations about racism, spearheaded by local leaders and community groups. People who had once stayed silent about their own experiences were now speaking up, sharing their stories in town hall meetings and community forums. One of the most encouraging developments was that Green Hill Pharmacy, under new management, had implemented a comprehensive anti-bias training program for its employees. Gary Matthews was long gone, but the pharmacy had taken steps to rebuild trust with the community. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was progress. One afternoon, as Marcus strolled through downtown Riverton, he saw Olivia Reed, the reporter who had first written his story. She was sitting outside a cafe, sipping a coffee and reading a book. "Marcus," Olivia called, waving him over. "How's the big-time advocate?" Marcus smiled as he approached her table. "I wouldn't call it that," he said, sitting down. "I'm just trying to do my part." "Don't be modest," Olivia said, her eyes twinkling. "You've done more than just your part. People around here are starting to pay attention. You've made a real difference." Marcus glanced down the street, where people moved about their day as if nothing had changed. But he knew better. Underneath the surface, Riverton had shifted. "I just hope we can keep the momentum going," he said. "It's easy to start these conversations, but keeping them alive, that's the hard part." Olivia nodded. "True, but look at where we were a year ago. No one in this town was even talking about racial bias, let alone doing something about it. And now people are aware. They're engaged. That's because of you." Marcus smiled, grateful for her words. "I guess you're right. I miss him." Marcus paused, considering the question. He had been so focused on the immediate battles, the lawsuit, the advocacy work, that he hadn't had much time to think about the future. But now, as things began to settle, he realized he had a new path ahead of him. "I think I'm going to keep teaching," Marcus said. "But I also want to keep working on this issue, both here in Riverton and nationally. There's so much more to be done, and I want to be a part of it." Olivia smiled. "I had a feeling you'd say that." As the months went on, Marcus continued to split his time between his teaching job in Riverton and his advocacy work on a broader scale. But more and more, he found himself drawn to the local community, the place where it had all started. He began working closely with local organizers, helping to create programs that addressed racial inequality in all aspects of Riverton life, not just healthcare, but education, law enforcement, and local businesses. The goal was to create a town where everyone, regardless of their background, could feel safe and respected. One of the most important initiatives Marcus helped launch was a youth mentorship program, pairing local high school students with mentors who could provide guidance and support. Many of these students, particularly those from marginalized communities, lacked access to the resources and opportunities they needed to succeed. Marcus saw the program as a way to give back to the community that had shaped him and to invest in the next generation. During one of the program's mentorship sessions, Marcus sat with a group of students, listening as they shared their thoughts on race, opportunity, and the future. One young man, a quiet kid named Jamal, raised his hand. "Mr. James," Jamal began hesitantly, "I know you went through a lot with that case at Green Hill. Do you ever feel like you made the right choice? Like, was it worth it?" The question took Marcus by surprise, but after a moment, he nodded. "Yes," he said, his voice firm. "It was hard, and there were times when I doubted myself. But in the end, I know I did the right thing." The foundation became a beacon of hope for those who needed it most, a testament to Tom's legacy and to the power of redemption. It's uncomfortable and it's scary, but if we don't stand up for ourselves and for others, nothing ever changes. Jamal looked thoughtful, nodding as he absorbed Marcus' words. "That's why we're all here today," Marcus continued, looking around at the students. "You all have the power to make a difference. It might not seem like it now, but one day, when you're faced with a choice to stand up or stay silent, you'll know what to do." The room was quiet, but Marcus could see the impact his words had on the students. They were listening. They were learning. And that was the most important thing. As Marcus reflected on everything he had accomplished, the lawsuit, the advocacy, the mentorship program, he realized that his life had taken on a new purpose. He was no longer just a teacher in a small town. He was a leader, an advocate, and a voice for those who had been silenced for too long. But through it all, Marcus remained humble. He knew that the fight for justice was far from over, and that every victory was just one step in a much larger journey. There would always be more to do, more battles to fight, more voices to uplift. One evening, as he sat on his front porch, watching the sun set over Riverton, Marcus allowed himself a moment of peace. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready for whatever came next. He thought about his mother, Elaine, who had worried so much about him during the lawsuit, and about Darren, who had stood by his side through every step of the process. He thought about Sarah Collins, who had believed in him even when he doubted himself. And he thought about the countless people across the country who had supported him, who had shared their own stories, and who had inspired him to keep going. This was just the beginning. The fight for racial justice, for equality, for a better world, it was long, difficult, and full of setbacks. But Marcus James was ready, and with that thought, he stood up, ready to face the new day ahead. The sun dipped below the horizon as Marcus stood on his porch, taking in the quiet evening. Riverton was still the same small town he had always known, but for him, it felt different now. His life had been transformed by the journey he had taken. A journey he hadn't asked for, but had embraced when it mattered most. The court victory against Greenhill Pharmacy had been more than just a personal triumph. It had been a wake-up call for the town and for many others across the country. People were beginning to understand that racism wasn't always loud and obvious sometimes. It was hidden in plain sight, woven into the everyday interactions that shaped people's lives. As Marcus reflected on the past year, he knew that the fight for justice and equality was far from over. There were still many more battles to come, but he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had seen firsthand the power of speaking up, of refusing to stay silent in the face of injustice. And he wasn't done yet. The youth mentorship program was thriving, giving young people in Riverton the tools and guidance they needed to navigate a world that wasn't always fair. His advocacy work had grown beyond the town's borders, reaching a national audience that was eager for change. And through it all, Marcus remained grounded in his core belief that standing up for what was right was always worth the cost. His phone buzzed with a new message from Darren. "You ready for tomorrow? Big rally in the city." Marcus smiled. There was always something on the horizon, always another step to take. He typed back, "I'll be there. Let's keep this going." Closing the door behind him, Marcus sat down at his kitchen table, pulling out his notebook and jotting down a few thoughts. He knew that the fight for equality and justice would require persistence and courage, but he was ready for whatever came next. He was more than just a teacher, no, he was a voice for those who had been unheard for too long, and he wasn't going to stop until real change had been achieved. With a deep breath, Marcus closed the notebook, stood up, and walked toward the future with a quiet but determined resolve. Thank you for reading Marcus' Journey. If you've enjoyed this story and want to be part of more inspiring journeys and creative stories, be sure to hit the subscribe button below to stay updated. Your support helps keep these stories going. As part of this foundation, part of this family, and that will never change. Rachel nodded, her eyes full of gratitude and love. "I'm glad we found our way back to each other, Mary. I'm glad we built this together." Mary's throat tightened with emotion. "So am I," she whispered. "It's the greatest gift I've ever been given." As the evening grew darker and the park began to empty, David ran over to them, his face flushed with excitement. "Grandma, Mom," he called, waving from across the field. "We're going to get ice cream. Want to come?" Rachel laughed and shook her head. "You go ahead, sweetie. We'll catch up in a bit." David grinned and gave them a thumbs up before running off with his friends, leaving Mary and Rachel alone on the bench, the quiet of the evening settling around them. For a while they sat in companionable silence, watching the sky turn from orange to pink to deep purple. The oak tree they had planted for Tom stood tall and strong nearby, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. It had grown so much over the years, just like their family, steady, resilient, and rooted in love. After a long moment, Rachel broke the silence, her voice thoughtful. "I've been thinking about the future," she said quietly. Mary glanced at her, sensing the seriousness in Rachel's tone. "What about it?" Rachel smiled faintly. "About what's next for the foundation, for David, for all of us." Mary listened intently, knowing that Rachel's words held the weight of something important. "I've been thinking," Rachel continued, "that maybe it's time for David to start thinking about college. He's been talking a lot about studying social work, or maybe even education. He wants to help kids, just like the foundation does." Mary's heart swelled with pride. "That's wonderful," she said, her voice full of warmth. "He's got such a big heart, just like Tom." Rachel nodded. "He does, and I think he's ready for the next step. But I also think it's time for me to take a step back from the foundation. I've been running things for a long time, and while I love it, I want to focus more on David and what comes next for him." Mary's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this, but as she looked at Rachel, she saw the wisdom in her words. Rachel had poured her heart and soul into the foundation for years, and now it was time for her to shift her focus. David was growing up, and Rachel wanted to be there for him as he took on the challenges of adulthood. "I understand," Mary said softly. "But what about the foundation? You've been the heart of it." Rachel smiled warmly. "The foundation has a life of its own now. We've built something that can carry on without us being there every day. And besides, he'll still be involved, just not as much as before." Mary nodded, feeling a mixture of sadness and understanding. The foundation had been their joint effort, a way to honor Tom's memory and give back to the community. But now, it was time for things to change, for the next generation to step up and take the reins. "Who do you think will take over?" Mary asked, her curiosity piqued. Rachel hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "I've been thinking about asking David." Mary's eyes widened in surprise. "David?" Rachel nodded, her eyes twinkling with pride. "He's young, but he's passionate about the foundation. He's been involved for years, and I think he's ready to take on more responsibility. Of course, we'd still be there to guide him, but I think it's time for him to start making his own mark." Mary felt her heart swell with emotion. The thought of David taking over the foundation Carrying on the work that had started with Tom felt like the perfect way to continue their legacy. It was a full-circle momentum that felt deeply meaningful. "I think that's a wonderful idea," Mary said softly. "He's going to do great things." Rachel smiled, her eyes misting over with emotion. "I think so too." A few months later, David officially took on a leadership role at the foundation. Though he was still young, he approached the position with a maturity and wisdom that belied his age. He worked tirelessly, organizing new programs, meeting with community leaders, and mentoring the next generation of volunteers. Mary watched with pride as David grew into his role, stepping confidently into the legacy that Tom had left behind. The foundation continued to thrive, expanding its reach and helping more families than ever before.
It was everything they had dreamed of and more.
One afternoon, as Mary sat in her office at the foundation, reviewing some paperwork, David knocked on the door and poked his head inside. "Hey, Grandma," he said with a smile. "Got a minute?" Mary looked up from her desk and smiled warmly. "Of course. Come on in." David stepped inside and sat down across from her, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about something," he began, his tone serious. Mary set down her papers, giving him her full attention. "What's on your mind?" David hesitated for a moment, then leaned forward, his eyes bright with determination. "I want to start a new program at the foundation, something specifically for kids who have lost a parent." Mary's heart skipped a beat. "That sounds like a wonderful idea," she said softly. "What made you think of it?" David glanced out the window, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking a lot about Dad lately," he said quietly, "about how much I wish I could have known him. And I know there are other kids out there who feel the same way about their parents' kids who are dealing with that kind of loss. I want to create a space where they can talk about it, where they can get support, and feel like they're not alone." Mary felt tears prick at her eyes. She had always known that David had a big heart, but hearing him speak with such passion and empathy filled her with pride. "That's a beautiful idea, David," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I think your dad would be so proud of you." David smiled, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I just want to make a difference, like he did." Mary reached across the desk and took David's hand, squeezing it gently. "You already are," she said softly, "and I know this program will help so many kids. I'll do everything I can to support you." David nodded, his smile growing. "Thanks, Grandma. That means a lot." The program, called Healing Hearts, launched a few months later, and it quickly became one of the most successful initiatives at the foundation. Children who had experienced loss found a safe space to share their feelings, connect with others, and receive emotional support. The program offered counseling, art therapy, and group activities designed to help children process their grief in healthy and meaningful ways. Mary watched as the program flourished, and she couldn't help but feel that Tom's spirit was guiding them every step of the way. His dream of building a better future for the next generation was alive and well, carried forward by his son and the family he had left behind. As the years went by, the foundation continued to grow, and David eventually became its full-time director. His leadership was marked by compassion, innovation, and a deep commitment to the community. Mary remained involved, though she took on a more advisory role, content to watch as David and the team carried on the work she and Rachel had started. On a bright spring day, Mary, Rachel, and David gathered once again beneath the oak tree they had planted for Tom so many years ago. The tree had grown tall and strong, its branches spreading wide to provide shade and comfort. It had become a symbol of everything they had built together, of love, of family, and of the strength to overcome. As they sat together on a bench, watching the children play in the park, Mary felt a profound sense of peace. She had come so far on her journey, from a place of fear and guilt, to a life filled with love, forgiveness, and purpose. She had made mistakes, but she had worked to make things right, and in the process, she had built something beautiful. Rachel leaned against Mary's shoulder, her face soft with contentment. "We did it, Mary," she whispered. "We built something lasting." Mary nodded, her eyes misting over with emotion. "We did," she whispered, "and it's all because of Tom." David, sitting across from them, smiled warmly. "Has the reason we're all here," he said quietly, "and we're going to keep his legacy alive for as long as we can." Mary's heart swelled with pride and love. She had been given a second chance, and she had made the most of it. She had found redemption, not just for herself, but for her family and her community. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the park, Mary looked up at the oak tree, its leaves rustling gently in the breeze. She thought of Tom, of everything he had stood for, and she smiled. His legacy would live on, through the foundation, through David, and through the love that had brought them all together. And for Mary, that was enough. Do you believe in second chances? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories.